version of the book No Bullsh Leadership. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Pallas Athéné Publishing House, I would like to thank you for joining this event. My name is Katinka Cseh. I am the Managing Director of the Pallas Athéné Publishing House. We are really honored that we have the opportunity to organize this event with Hirst and Tamara Szabó. Furthermore, we are grateful that Líra Könyv will host this event. Last year, we have published the Hungarian version of the book No Bullsh Leadership, written by Hirst, who is the global CEO of Havas Creative and leads more than 10,000 people across all Havas global territories. To this event, we also have Tamara Szabó, who is the translator of the book, and she is working as a coach for legacy. Now, Hirst and Tamara Szabó is here with us live, and I would like to give the floor to them.
Thank you, Katinka. And hello, everyone. We are very happy that you're joining us here tonight. And what's going to happen in the upcoming around 50 minutes, that after a quick introduction from us, we will move over to the topic of No Bullsh Leadership. And then we will have a dedicated session for your questions. If you're very eager to ask a question, you can just ask a question anytime. But it might be so that we will only answer it later on in the dedicated Q&A session. And just one additional request to you. Chris was just mentioning that he practiced a bit of his Hungarian, but maybe it's better if you post your questions in English so that he could also make sense of it. So Chris, how about you start the introduction? If you would like to add anything to what Katinka has just said.
I think she did a pretty good job. Yeah, I'll just tell you briefly who I am. So for those that might have missed it, so my name is Hirst. I am the global CEO of Havas Creative Group. For those that aren't familiar with Havas, we are a multidisciplinary, multi-market marketing services network, which in old money means that we do advertising in all its guises, advertising, media, digital, social, etc., etc. And so that's my day job, but I'm also, which I guess is why you asked me on here today, I'm very flattered and honored to be asked, thank you. I'm also the author of No Bullsh Leadership, which I guess we'll come and talk about. It's also worth just saying that, so I'm actually in London today, and this is my first day. I don't actually live in London, I work in London, but my family home is outside London. So this is my first day in London, I think, for 12 weeks. In fact, it's my first time in this apartment for 12 weeks. So it's all a bit strange.
Kind of showing you're returning back to some of the routines.
Exactly.
And as for myself, so as Katinka mentioned, I'm the person who translated your book, and it was a great privilege to do that. And it was really a great challenge and mental exercise to put your concepts into Hungarian. And actually, my normal daily job is not translation, but I work for a company called Legacy, and we work with organizational development, and hence I meet a lot of leaders. I develop a lot of leaders, and actually, the concepts of the book are very useful in leadership development programs, but we will come back to this later on. So, just to check how many of you who are with us consider themselves to be leaders, could you just please press the like button if you think you're a leader yourself? Now let us see what do we have coming up. So if you're a leader, just press like. Now, I would assume we have lots and lots of likes coming up. We have a technical person supporting us. Akash, can you give us some clue what's happening there? Yep. Okay, so we've got the likes coming up. Now I wonder how it's going to change when we shed some light on how you interpret leadership. So Chris, can you say a few words about your definition of leadership?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a go at answer. First of all, I'm gonna answer two questions. I'm gonna have a go at answering on behalf of everybody else the question you just asked. That's a bit presumptuous, obviously, but I think that maybe not everybody, because some people don't want to be leaders. That's fine as well, by the way. But I think many more people are in leadership positions than there are people that think of themselves as leaders. That's a slightly convoluted way of putting it. But in the subtitle of the English version of the book, the full title is No Bullshit Leadership: Why the World Needs More Everyday Leaders and Why That Leader Is You. So that does bring me to answering your actual question, which is what is leadership? And my definition of leadership is taking a group of people from a defined point in the present to a different and clearly defined point in the future. I think that a lot of leadership, not just books, frankly, a lot of leadership teaching, whether that be business schools, consultants, dare I say it, training programs. I think a lot of them focus on defining the end destination. So, you know, in really simple terms, define where you are to start with, define where you are now, define where you want to get to. Now, a lot of leadership programs essentially end that they say that's it. The definition of the destination is what leadership's about. My definition of leadership is actually the journey between the two places. And a journey of any sort is about doing things. And I think that you can think about that concept of that by that definition of leadership, you could say there's an awful lot of people in leadership positions, and those leadership positions aren't necessarily just businesses. I mean, they could be, you know, we're in the middle of a global health emergency, right? That could be running the ward in a hospital. I mean, somebody's just put up leading a decent life. I mean, I think that you could see it as a way of managing your own life, absolutely, as well. So I think hopefully it's a useful definition people can actually then do something with.
And actually, I very much like this broad definition of leadership, which is not exclusive at all, but it can, so a lot of people can think of themselves in different terms. They can think of themselves as leaders, even though before they probably never have done that. And once you raise the title, the full title, but I never asked you actually, even though we talked a couple of times, that what made you choose this title for the book? Because on one hand, it's very catchy, and on the other hand, it's quite provocative.
Well, so I actually, it's a slightly cliched answer, but I actually woke up one Saturday morning and thought, no bullshit leadership. I think that's quite a good idea for a book. So I don't know why it came to me. But actually, it's interesting you pick up on it, because I had a kind of as I was writing it, the interesting thing about the title is it's a little bit like my definition of leadership. I defined the end point that I wanted to get to, and actually it's quite a useful title to try and write to. So as you're sitting writing, you're thinking, well, obviously you think, well, I've got to try and find 50,000 words. And not only that, but I've got to try and find 50,000 words that have some sort of coherence, that forms some sort of narrative. I mean, I know it's not a fiction book, but it still needs a narrative. And I think the title was very useful in that regard. But I did sort of flip-flop between thinking, should the title be No Bullshit Leadership, or should the title be Everyday Leaders? And I think in the end, I'm glad that I went for No Bullshit Leadership. But there's something about everyday leaders. There's something about the idea of an accessibility to leadership, because I do think the word itself, in some ways, puts some people off, because you know, either they don't think of themselves as leaders, or they think, oh, you know, I don't want to read another, frankly, just another samey leadership book. The final point I'd make, though, is that I think it is, you know, maybe it's a provocative title, but it's I think it's about just over a year ago now that I published it first in the UK, and at some points I think the title, I sometimes worry isn't the right word. I sometimes question the title, only because I think it can be seen by some people as rather flippant. I don't know if that is a word that easily translates into Hungarian. Rather jokey, or, you know, light-hearted. And I think, therefore, some people might think of it as not a proper, you know, not a proper leadership book, because it's kind of because it's you know, got a rude word in the title. Therefore, is it not a serious leadership book? And I think it is a serious leadership book, and I think if it's a very, I mean, I'm just being honest with you. I think sometimes maybe the title helps with some audiences, but I think with other audiences maybe not.
Well, what I found with the Hungarian audience, that the title resonates really well, and it's quite a help. But that's actually, without asking you, I was discussing with my colleagues when I was translating the book about the title as well. And what we have found, and I think that's one of the big assets of the book, is that you pretty much go back to the basics of leadership. And now when there is talk, there is so much fluffy stuff about leadership. And well, I have to admit that sometimes we are approached by companies saying that, can you just offer something new, something trendy, something hype for our leaders?
Yeah.
And, you know, the obvious questions what you are asking is that, okay, but how you are with the basics? Oh, we've all learned that. Okay, but are you doing it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's one thing to learn these things, and it's one thing to apply the things. And I think this is one of the key or at least I found it one of the key messages of the book. And I think this is something which makes this book so appealing, that it's about acting things. It's about whatever you think about, whatever you have learned, apply it. It's what you refer to as journey. The journey it takes from where we are to where we're going.
I agree with that. I mean, the way I think about it is, I think that leadership, it's interesting that people come and ask you that question. You know, can you tell us something new? You know, we know all that old stuff, but now we want some new stuff. And I think that's part of the problem with the subject of leadership, if I'm really honest. So I think of leadership as being difficult but not complicated.
Yeah.
I think the subject is not a complicated subject. Now, that said, I think there are what I refer to in the book. I don't know if you have the expression, but we talk here about the military industrial complex, which is this kind of rather sort of sort of unpleasant sort of kind of governmental sort of sense. And in the book, I talk about the leadership industrial complex.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is there are a large number of very powerful institutions, consultancies, business books. So I've written one of those. Training companies, you're one of those. Business schools, off-sites, etc., who make an awful lot of money out of the subject of leadership and have a vested interest in making the subject complicated. Because guess what? If the subject is complicated, hey, you need us because we're the answer. And I think that this is I genuinely think this is a real problem, and I say it for two reasons. The first reason is because that belief that leadership is some enlightened state open only to a chosen few inhibits people who are already in leadership positions from fulfilling their potential. So I've already said that I think there's actually in Hungary, hundreds of thousands of people, by my definition, millions of people possibly, who are leaders. And if you say that only a certain number of people can be leaders because it's very complicated, you have to have been to Harvard, then they're never going to fulfill their potential. The second problem, I think, is even worse, which it actually says to large parts of our population, leadership is just not something that is open to people like you. And in actual fact, what we need is our societies, never more so than now, you might argue. In our societies, we need more better leaders everywhere. And so I think it's really important that we frankly wipe away the bullshit from the subject and are really clear what leadership is, because there is still lots and lots of roles for consultants and training programs and books and business schools, because it's difficult. It's not complicated, but it's very, very difficult to do well, and we all know that from personal experience.
And actually, a few minutes ago, Kati asked a question. And Kati, thank you very much for asking all these questions. And I would like to encourage the others as well, that if you hear something that catches your attention, feel free to post some emojis or feel free to make a comment. So just going back to that question about the myths about leadership, I very often sense that there is this, what you also mentioned, there is this underlying limiting belief that you're either born to be a leader or not. And I think this is one of the novelties of your approach, is that you don't have to be born to be a leader. It's something that can easily be learned. Not easily, but can be learned. And with some focused effort. It can be acquired, and you can act as a leader. You can take a group of people from A to B. So yeah, so it's open to everybody.
I think it is. My analogy is that if you're clear on what you're trying to learn, so if you demystify leadership, which is what I've tried to do, and you try and say, okay, in order to be, first of all, what is leadership? And then, through the rest of the book, well, okay, how do you go about achieving it? First of all, do that. But I think it's a bit like, I don't know, learning a musical instrument. Okay, so I don't think I'm ever going to be a virtuoso piano player, but I do know that if I practice the piano every day, I'm going to be an awful lot better at the end of a year, 5 years, 10 years, than if I don't practice the piano. And I'm also going to learn more quickly if somebody who does know how to do it can teach and explain to me in ways that I can understand. And I think leadership is something you can learn. I think it is open to everybody. Does that mean that some people might end up being more effective or better at it than others? Yeah, I think it does. I think that is reasonable. And by the way, I think some of that is context. I think somebody who can be a very good leader in one context might not necessarily be a good leader in a different one.
And I think there is an important thing about it. You can learn it, but I think it also depends on whether you enjoy this learning process.
Yeah.
Whether you can be passionate about the things you try, whether you can be okay with failing sometimes. And it's just the entire learning process has to be somehow joyful. So I think only those going to make at the end of the day good leaders who enjoy being a leader and who enjoy developing themselves as leaders.
I think that's true, and that's why I think context context I think is quite important. So I think you could take the same person and they might be a you know, I don't know, they might work in an advertising agency, okay, let's say, just to pick one example. You know, and maybe they don't think that that's an environment where they really want to go on and be a, you know, a CEO or whatever, and they think, you know, I'm quite happy with my job, but I'm not sure that really leadership, this sort of leadership, is for me. But that same person might run a football team at weekends. You know, they might run a kids football team or even an adults football team. They may be a coach. And they very much might want to lead in that environment. And so leadership, you know, the principles of leadership still apply. I mean, to my mind, I mean, the basic principles of what makes, you know, that define your start, define your end, how are you going to get there? I argue that is just as relevant for a Sunday league football team as it is the CEO of a global corporation.
And I think that's another great thing about the book, that, well, on one hand, you're bringing examples, not just from business context, but other contexts as well. And actually, whatever you're saying is applicable in business context, but in a lot of other contexts as well. So it's, yeah, I think that's a great thing about the book. And actually, just going back to everybody can be a leader, and it can be learned if they know what to learn. And I think what you offer in the book is quite a good structure to navigate through that complexity that leaders today have to work with. And just those wide range of expectations, wide range of tasks they have to handle. So the structure you're offering and those focal points really help to be up to all those expectations and be up to the job.
Sorry, what help me, tell me, ask me the question again. What specifically is the question?
There was no question. It was just contemplating.
Yeah, I
contemplating on what you were saying.
Absolutely, yes, I do.
And actually, when we also starting to discuss your book and just to team up and work out something based on the book, this was the idea behind, just to give a structure to those who are either freshly appointed leaders or those who have been in leading positions but have felt that something is missing and that they need some extra to reinvigorate that willingness to change things around them. So that was I think this was one of the starting point of our discussion. Yeah,
I mean, I hope that when I sat down and started to write the book, I was, you know, I think the first sentence in the book, or somewhere in the first paragraph, I think I say the last thing the world needs right now is another book on leadership. And you know, I decided it needed one more. So, you know, I think, and the reason I say that is because I think it is just very, very well-traveled territory. And what I kind of wanted to do was, you know, I think you've picked up that I think that leadership is about doing. You know, leadership, you know, PowerPoint, you know, thinking is important. PowerPoint is important, but ultimately leadership is about doing. It's getting between those two places, start and your destination. And in that sense, I wanted the book to feel a bit like a manual. You know, I mean, you can read it chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order, but at the same time, I think you can fold. You know, I think I say fold over the pages, tear the pages out, underline bits. You know, treat it like a manual, because I think there are lots of different aspects of leadership. I think everybody has their own challenges. Everybody finds some bits easier than others. I think from the feedback I've had, I think lots of different people get all sorts of different parts of the book resonate differently with different people, I think. And I also think that leadership, like I say, my view is, we talked about what do I think leadership is. We haven't said really what I think a leader is. And I think that you can consider anybody that has people they are responsible for
but also who are followed, I guess.
Can consider themselves as a leader. So that's why I say that I think there are many, many, many more leaders in the world than we think of. Because typically when we think of leaders, we think of CEOs or generals or presidents. But actually, if we say anybody that has people who they're responsible for, you could have leaders who are 2 years, 1 year out of university, who have 2 people, 3 people working for them. They, to those people, are a leader. And those people's, a huge amount of those people's effectiveness, frankly, just their level of enjoyment of what they're doing will be influenced by that person. And the problem is, a lot of us find ourselves in leadership positions. So by that definition, I could say that I've been in a leadership position, you know, since year 2 of leaving university, which is a very long time ago now. But the problem is, we're in leadership positions for a very long time, but nobody teaches us how to do it. So we're always learning on the job. You know, we're always kind of making it up as we go along. We have good leaders, we have bad leaders, and we try and learn the right lessons. But even then, you know, we're left to our own devices to work out what those are. And that's why I wanted a book. I mean, part of me thinks I sort of, this is going to sound such a sort of a humble brag thing to say. It's not meant to be, but part of me wishes that I sort of hadn't put so much in. I wish I'd gone, you know, I jammed it all in. I wish I'd gone, you know, I could probably write 8 books here. But again, that is what I wanted. I don't think it needs to be 8 books. I think you can get an awful lot out of one, because it's not complicated. It's not, you know, I can help you as a leader with the decomplicating, sorry, that's not a real word, but you know, I can help with the uncomplicatingness of it, because it's difficult but not complicated. The bit is more that is hard for me to help you with is the doing bit. At the end of the day, I can write as many words down as I like. I can help you do the path. I can tell you how to take decisions. I can tell you why culture matters. But at the end of the day, for us to be effective leaders, we have to get up off the couch and we have to go and do things. And I think that's why leadership's difficult.
And just about this doing aspect, when we were discussing what kind of a program we want to build around the book, this was a key aspect. Just to build the actual doing into the learning, because so it shouldn't just be the result of the program that they want to do something based on the new knowledge, but it's in between the modules, doing a lot of already applying the knowledge. And you mentioned a few things about how the different parts of the book may resonate with the reader, and I think one way of giving a clear structure is just choosing the topics you write about, because with choosing different topics, you decide not to talk about other topics, and just showing what are the really essential part of leadership today. And maybe we should mention some of the topics that you are covering in the book, just to give a teaser to our audience who haven't read it yet.
Are you going to test me to see if I can remember?
Well, let me give you a question. Which was the most difficult? Which was the most difficult chapter to write?
Which was the most difficult chapter to write? But probably the last chapter. Only because you think, oh, I probably need to write a bit more. What else am I gonna write about? I think, what was the most difficult chapter to write? That's actually a really good question. I think maybe the chapter on decision making, because I think decision. So I've talked about leadership is about literally taking people from one place to another. There's no definition of leadership that I can think of that doesn't involve people. Leadership is about people, and it's about getting a group of people to follow you, to do the things, under your influence. And the question becomes how. And I think it is, I think it's sort of the $1 million question in people that study leadership. And by the way, I haven't ever studied leadership. I've written a book based on my practical experience. I think I say in the book, you know, do as many courses as you like. I'm not going to sit and say what's good and what's bad. I'm not going to tell people to go to business school or not go to business school. It's everybody must find their own way. But what I do say in the book, and maybe it's a slightly controversial thing to say, but I say, you know, listen to whoever you like, but don't listen to leadership advice from people who've never been leaders. Because you wouldn't learn to fly from somebody who'd never been a pilot, and I do stand by that. And I did try and write the book from which is not to say that people can't do other things as well, of course. But in terms of decision making, I think the way you actually so you want to get between these two places. What do you have to do in order to do that? And it's about taking action. And what is taking action? I think taking action is making decisions. And I think a lot of people find that difficult. Frankly, we all find it difficult. Taking decisions can be very difficult. But I also think it's a bit like driving. You know, nobody ever admits to being a bad driver, but anybody that's spent more than 20 minutes on a motorway knows there's an awful lot of bad drivers. And I think it's a bit like leadership and decision making. You never find somebody in a leadership position who admits to being bad at making decisions, but any of us who've spent more than 6 months in any organization know that there's an awful lot of leaders, or at least people in leadership positions, who are bad at making decisions. So I think that the sitting down, it's one thing saying I think decision making is a critical part of leadership. And people who are effective at decision making will make more effective leaders. I do believe that. It's a different question to say, okay, how do you help people be better at making decisions? And so therefore that was I had to think about that for a bit.
And actually, I very much like the practical approach in the book, and I very much like how you are, for instance, reframing decision making. And just to give yet another teaser to our audience, I think this is a great reframing, that you shouldn't be afraid of making. No, wait a second. You shouldn't be afraid of failing with a decision, but rather you should be afraid of not making enough decisions. Exactly. I wasn't quoting word by word, but to me that was the essence.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Which is not. It's not to say that, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. I think a lot of decisions that we have to make, and all of us in our lives, we make decisions all the time. And I think it's Jeff Bezos talks about one-way doors and two-way doors in the context of decision making. And I think the analogy is pretty obvious, right? Most decisions we make are actually two-way doors. We can just change our minds. We don't like changing our minds sometimes, and we don't, because we feel like we feel it's a sign of weakness, or we look like we failed if we have to change our minds. I actually think it's a sign of strength. And in fact, I don't know if you want to talk about politics, but one of my huge frustrations with politics and politicians is that it is seen as the most terrible crime for a politician to change their mind. Whereas in actual fact, what I want politicians that are absolutely prepared to change their mind. I was going to say all the time, maybe not all the time, but often, because it's the only way you progress. If you believe you can make progress by only getting decisions right, you will never take a decision, because you will never get all your decisions right. So I suppose that the way to frame that thought is, if you want to progress, you have to take decisions. You have to accept the inevitability of getting some of those decisions wrong, or at the very least suboptimal, and that's just definitely going to happen. And I think if you can accept that, it's actually quite liberating, because then you say, well, I'm going to get some wrong. What I need to worry about more than getting them wrong is I need to worry about not making enough decisions quickly enough. And actually, Colin Powell, who is the the American general and statesman, he had a great quote, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it because I don't have it written down exactly in front of me right now. But he said basically, if you feel more than 70% certain that you're right, you've waited too long. And I think that is a really important way to think about it, because what a lot of people do is they delay making decisions. That's what happens. People delay making decisions in the hope that at some future point, some new piece of information will arrive that will mean that they are going to be exactly right. Now, first of all, I have never come across a clear correlation between waiting longer and being more right. But second of all, and I think this is an equally important point, that if you have a choice, let's call it a choice rather than decision. So if that might be a bit semantic to some of you, but if you have a choice in front of you between going through left-hand door and right-hand door, if you know with 100% certainty that one door will be the right choice and one door will be the wrong choice, then it isn't a decision.
Yeah.
A decision by definition.
And honestly, do we have situations like that in today's business life when you can be 100% sure?
Yes, but well, not just that, but a decision by definition is a choice you have to make without 100% clarity of the implications. So decisions by definition are taken with imperfect information, and they are also taken without complete certainty of what the outcome will be. So you just have to get used to that, embrace that, and get on with it.
And I think this is one of the keys to future leaders, how much they can embrace this kind of uncertainty and how comfortable they can be with this kind of uncertainty.
Can I jump in? I'm just reading the questions here, and Katie, if I pronounced, is it Katie? Am I pronouncing her name right? Sorry, Katie. Sorry, has just asked a question that I think is a really interesting question, because I was this actually isn't. I don't really cover this in my book, but I was talking to a historian the other day who writes a lot about great military, specifically military leaders. And she has written, and leaders' moral and ethical stance is important. There is no question that leaders' moral and ethical stance is important. But his argument is an interesting one. That his argument is, and this, you could say this is kind of scary maybe, but his argument is that leadership per se is amoral. So leadership as a concept doesn't have either good or bad attached to it. So you can look through history, and I was talking to him because he has written a book, and so you look at great in inverted commas, and by great I mean kind of famous, not great as in we love them, leaders, and you can have on one hand maybe Churchill and Eisenhower on one hand, but then you can have Hitler and Stalin on the other hand, and they all led, they all led, and by the way, then you've got whole loads of other leaders where you might have more ambiguity about your views on them, but leadership itself doesn't have morals, and yes, of course we want leaders who do, but I think what's dangerous is people can apply the principles of leadership and do terrible things with them, because people can be led. I don't cover that, but I think it's important.
Now that we have started to move over to the questions, so how about we take a look at the questions? And so now we are getting back the questions. I think we mentioned a few things about this common blocks, this underlying limiting belief, for instance. But is there anything you would like to add to that?
Common blocks.
I think wanting to please others is also a common block to successful leadership. Wanting to please the organization, wanting to please the team.
without doubt. I think that actually links to that decision-making piece.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
actually, in that quite one of the, we talked about worrying about getting decisions wrong. I mean, one of the things that can be difficult about this journey, we know where we are, we know where we want to get to, but getting along that journey often means you have to do things that are unpopular with people, whether they be the people that work for you, your peers, your clients, your customers, your bosses. I mean, it all depends. But I think that preparedness, frankly, to be a bit unpopular. I give you a quote about Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher, after she, not long before she died, one of her former ministers went to see her, and she was a very old lady by this point, but she was still very, very, very interested in politics and how the party was doing. And the minister went to see her, and she always would ask, how are we doing in the polls? How are we doing in the polls? And he said, "Oh, Margaret, it's good news. We're doing." So the Conservatives were in government at the time, but not her, obviously. And he said, "Oh, it's good news, Margaret. We're doing well in the polls at the moment." And she said, "That's not good news. At this point, we should be doing badly, because if we're doing too well in the polls, it means we're not taking enough action. We have to take the actions now, and they might be unpopular, and we have to believe that by the time the election comes, the popularity will come back." And I think it's quite an interesting way of addressing that point, which is actually sometimes doing the right thing the right thing in the long term can be quite unpopular in the short term. And I think the leader has to have the self-belief and an extent courage to be prepared to get on with it. I think other blocks. I mean, I do talk in the book about about how hard it is to be a leader. I think I talk about leaders being like batteries, and you end up, if you're the leader, you almost can't have a bad day. If you're the leader and you go into the office and you sit with your head down on the desk, first, however much you might feel like doing that, the rest of your team are going to be like, oh, So it's almost like you quite often have to find yourself providing the energy for others. You have to be the sort of energy of last resource for your team. But all of us have only got so much energy to give. All of us are human. And I think, therefore, as a leader, you have to make sure you're looking after yourself, and that's a very personal, how you do that. That's a very personal thing. But for me, that is about being able to compartmentalize. Again, this historian I was talking to was talking about Napoleon, and Napoleon said that he said Napoleon was unbelievably good at compartmentalizing. He said in his head he had lots of cupboards, and when he wanted to think about one particular subject, he'd open that cupboard, he'd shut all the other doors, and he'd do that. And when he wanted to go to sleep, he just shut all the doors, and that was that. And
what a great ability!
Yeah, it's a great. Not all of us have got that ability, but maybe that's a sort of a 19th century way of saying look after your mental health.
And I think when it comes to this journey that you were talking about, I think leadership is also a journey in the sense that you will always have to discover new things about yourself and what your resources are and how you can use them. So it's also a journey into yourself.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a question here, isn't there, about the journey? I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think somebody somewhere as well asked a question about whether leadership varies by the extent to which leadership varies by culture, whether it's Western Europe, Eastern Europe, or indeed whether, I think another question is, are the techniques that work for leaders today the same as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Certainly, I think that this question about sharing with your team, I think that people want leaders to be human beings. They don't want robots, and I think more than ever, I think possibly once upon a time People wanted leaders who were very, we lived in very top-down cultures where people were just told what to do. They knew their position in the culture, whether it be a society's culture or whether it be an organization culture. And it was actually quite difficult to move, between those. I think now we live in cultures where it's easier. I don't think it's easy, but it's easier. And certainly we want cultures where it's easier still. And I think to do that, people expect now to have to want to have a more human relationship with their leader. Mm-hmm. They don't expect now to just be told what to do and go and do it. Social media, people will answer back to anybody now. People have a voice in a way that they didn't used to have, and they use that voice and they expect to use that voice. I think the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter protests at the moment are classic examples of that. But there's lots and lots and lots of more everyday examples as well. And I think, for example, one example for how a leader might behave in that context is I think to be prepared to be able to actually show weakness, because we all have weaknesses as people. And I think sometimes people as leaders think that they have to have all the answers, they have to know everything, they have to be absolutely certain what's going to happen. And they think that, first of all, if they don't have all those things, people won't respect them as leaders. And also, I think they fear that if they don't have all those things, people won't necessarily follow them. And I think actually the opposite is true. I think that people want leaders who are. So I'll give you a very everyday example of this. Is if you sit in meetings, which I'm sure everybody on this does all the time. I think a very powerful thing to ask in a meeting, or to say in a meeting, is "I don't know." How often have you sat in meetings and somebody will be talking about an acronym or explaining something, and you sit there and you think, I've no idea what this person's talking about, and you sit there and you think, I wonder if it's just me. I wonder if it's somebody else. And actually, somebody eventually has the courage to say, "I'm sorry, I don't quite understand this. Can you explain, please?" And the whole room goes, "Oh, thank God you asked," because I have no idea at all. And I know that seems a really trivial example, but the reason we don't say it is because we don't look like we don't know. But actually, it's actually a very confident. What we want is confident leaders. We don't want know-alls. We want people who are confident. And strangely enough, saying "I don't know," I mean, if you say "I don't know" every 3 minutes, that's not
a different story. Maybe you're at the wrong meeting.
Not good either, right? But I think that's an example. Being prepared to say "I don't know" is I think quite important, because often you don't, and also, of course, that's the way to get to an answer. Yeah.
And I think these are the kind of twists that if somebody reads the book or completes the program based on the book can have. So it's kind of a reframing again, that being confident doesn't mean always knowing the answer or being perfect, but being confident fully entails being able to say "I don't know," or being able to show your vulnerability.
Yeah, I think that's honestly, it's really important, because the fact is you don't know. I mean, even I said at the start, I talked about, we have to define our start point and our end point. What a huge amount of money is made by consultants, management consultants, training programs, management books, blah, blah, blah. A huge amount of money, billions and billions of dollars is made helping people define that end point. Because that end point is where things like visions and values and big, hairy, audacious goals and purposes and all these things that are buzzwords at different times, that's where they all live, at that end point. And we've been told by the leadership industrial complex that defining that end point is the ultimate expression of a leader's kind of capability. And what leaders try and do, and leadership teams try and do, therefore, is they try and come up with an incredibly clever answer to that question. And in fact, I have been part of leadership teams, and I bet many people listening to this have been part of leadership teams, where the team considers that answer to be so important that they actually never get past trying to answer it. Yeah. Whereas my argument is that is just a sort of a that can be. I mean, by the way, if you've got an incredibly clever answer, get on with it, right? But most of us won't have. And my point is, most of us don't need one. We just need a really easy to understand, easy to remember territory to aim for. Because quite often, if we're doing our job properly as leaders, we're quite a long way from that point at first. Now, as we get closer to it, we can start to refine our thinking. But if we try and define it to a pinhead, first of all, we'll probably be wrong anyway. And second of all, what we try and do is we try and come up with something unique. Okay, we try and think of something that nobody else has thought of. But in reality, most businesses, your business, my business, most of the businesses of the people on this call, most businesses are trying to do a common thing better than the competition. Okay, that's what basically that's what leadership is about. If you've got something unique, if you've got a patent for, like, I don't know, something incredible, then get the patent, get it made. You don't need to worry about any of this visions and values and things. Just make the unique thing you've got and go and sell it. Leadership is really about how do you take an ordinary group of people and get them to outperform the competition. And most organizations are about trying to do a common thing better than the competition. That's what football teams are trying to do. I mean, Roger Federer didn't say, I'm going to try and reinvent tennis. He just plays tennis a lot better than anybody else. And I think that's what that's where the leadership industrial complex gets in the way.
Okay, now we are starting to reach the end of the time available for us. So what would be your final word to our audience? What advice would you give them?
What advice would I give the audience? I think the best summary of what I think about leadership is that it's difficult, but it's not complicated. And I think both of those, the word difficult and the word complicated, are of equal importance, in the sense that we have to keep, anytime you're dealing with a leadership challenge and you hear people trying to overcomplicate it, come back and remind yourself that the fundamentals of it aren't complicated. Every leadership challenge, I think, can be broken down into the sections, I suppose, that I describe in the book. So that's the first thing. And you will continually come across people or situations that deliberately or otherwise trying to make it complicated. The other word, difficult, I think you also need to prepare yourself for, because that is true. If you're going to be a successful leader, it is difficult. And I think it's easy to say, people like to say things like cliches, like it's okay to fail, right? It's okay to fail. Every great leader has got lots of failures behind them. Every great inventor, went bankrupt first, and all these kind of things you read in Harvard Business Review and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure it's all true. But what we have to remember is, when it's happening to you, it's really, really unpleasant and difficult. And I don't say that to scare anybody. I'm just saying that it's okay to feel like that. It's not just you. Everybody. When people say it's difficult, that's what difficult means. Difficult means that you have a bad day or a bad week or a bad month, and what you have to do is look after yourself, be clear what you're trying to do, follow those basic principles. I think it's the basic principles that get you through it, because I think what matters as a leader most, is not that you agree with me about what leadership is. I think what matters most is that you have a clear philosophy of your own about what leadership is for you. That's the most important thing, because I think most people in leadership positions don't. I mean, I was in a leadership position for many, many, many years before I ever actually sat and thought about what leadership is, or at least what it is for me. And and I suppose the book that I wrote was the end of that. Well, not the end of that process, but it was a culmination of my observations to that point. But so it doesn't matter whether you agree with me, but it does matter, I think, that if you want to be an effective leader, that you sit and think about what your leadership philosophy is.
And I think the book is good at igniting this kind of critical thinking, so that they don't need to agree, but the statements are so direct that it really brings up the critical thinking of people. Yes. And actually, when I was listening to you, and I was just thinking back of those years when that I spent as a leader in a global organization, and actually, I thought, I wish the book had been available at that time. It would have been such a great help to me as a leader.
Good. Well, I'm delighted to hear it. I'm delighted to hear it. And I mean, it is. I actually really enjoyed writing it. I found it quite, it like exercised a different part of my brain. And, I talk about looking after yourself. I mean, that doesn't have to be going and lying on the sofa. I mean, we all recover in different ways, and we all recharge in different ways. And I think part of recharging it for some people, can just be doing something different. And so writing a book was something different. So I found it quite an enjoyable process as well. But it also, I think, helped me clarify my own leadership philosophy. And I didn't start with that book all planned out in my head. I started with a title, basically, and then and then kind of writing something down is a very clarifying process. You can have a kind of a gut feeling, but when you write it down, you think, well, hang on a minute, does that make sense? Or frankly, is it bullshit? And if it's bullshit, it can't go in my book.
But yeah, it's pretty much the same with us when we design any kind of program. Just structuring the program or preparing the training material, that really helps to make all your thoughts crystal clear.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for being here with us, and thank you very much for all the questions. And well, we hope to have Chris sometime in Hungary when it's going to be possible to travel in between the two countries, and it's going to be possible to organize some big events. So looking forward to seeing you there as well.
Me too. I'm confident.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.